I read The Whale Rider by Witi Ihimaera. I probably messed that up and said it wrong. I really apologize. This is a Maori writer of this novella that is a kind of magical realism coming of age story through the perspective of a young adult uncle to the main character, I would say, Kauhu, who is a girl that is born into a line of chiefs with spiritual authority that are patriarchal in the way that they hand down power and teach their magical traditions. And so a girl is not acceptable to inherit the power and secret knowledge that the leader of the tribe is supposed to have. But it seems like Kahu is the right person for the job, and her great-grandfather won't accept her. That's the main conflict of the book, I think. And so it starts with her as a baby and goes all the way up to her becoming like 10, 11, 12-year-old, something like that. But we don't get the direct perspective of either Pucka, the great-grandfather. I mean, that's not his name, but that's what everybody calls him. Or Kahu. We get her uncle, who is kind of a somewhat rebellious 20-something biker guy who lives in New Zealand but goes to New Guinea and some of the other places in that surrounding area and has other experiences that are, outside of this central story. And when the story starts off, it begins in a kind of mythic time, a period where whales and humans and the gods of both the whales and the humans are all kind of closely interacting with each other. The whales can talk to people and people can talk to the whales. And so that's where I say the magical realism of the whole thing. And it also talks about like the desires of the islands and the way in which the oceans think and deliberately move. It talks about, that people find them. And so the island itself feels as if it has been found. It has been anticipating being found. And so all of this invests the natural world with awareness, with consciousness, intent, memory, and all of these kind of human qualities, but it doesn't personify nature in a direct sense of like, here's the god of the island or something like that. Instead, it just has these qualities that are in common with humanity. And I think that's because we are supposed to understand it and bond with the island and the ocean and the sky and all of these other elements of nature in the same way that we bond with other people and with the characters in the story. We should care about the island as much as any other character, in other words. And that is the setting in which the world exists. We kind of like fast forward, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, who knows, into the modern time. So like 1980s New Zealand. And the world is divided in many, many ways at this point. So there's a sharp contrast that happens where at the beginning of the story, everything is mixed. The boundaries between things are hazy. And in the modern time that most of the story takes place in, the divisions are very, very sharp. There's, the white colonizing culture. There's the Maori culture on the other side of it. There's men, there's women, they can't mix, they can't have the same jobs. There's the traditional life of a Maori person, and then there's the modern existence that the uncle has. And so it's division after division after division. And there seems to be like a really sharp or huge, wide divide between the natural world and the human world. And we see the way in which, the uncle is disconnected from his culture as he rides around on a motorcycle with all of his other Maori buddies, all of his cousins. They all seem like really lovable, good guys, but at the same time, they want to study their culture and whatnot, but they're not as deeply into it as the great grandfather character, Pucka, who they call Super Maori. And so he's deeply invested in the stories and the language and all of these things that are slipping away from them. And he teaches people about the cultural context of this stuff. But these guys, leave the island, they go after work, in terms of like, am I going to get a job fishing over here or, doing sheep shearing or whatever they're going to do. They're not worried about preserving the culture so much. They like to learn about it. They like to know it. They feel pride in their Maori heritage, but they're not as worried about their way of life or their myths and legends and religion and things like that fading away as the great grandfather is. And because I think he sees his mortality kind of closing in on him. And death is a theme that comes up over and over to a surprising degree in this pretty short story that is ostensibly about a little girl. You have the death of one of his biker gang guys when there's a hit and run accident from one of the colonizers. They don't take responsibility for the way that, they hit him and then run away because they're scared that, the islanders are cannibals or something like that. And they're going to retaliate and murder them because of this traffic accident. And so there's racism, prejudice, misunderstanding. And then on top of that, you get later in the story, the whales who come to the beach by the hundreds and beach themselves and then die all in a day or two. And the huge effect that this has on the community and the main characters, how upset they are by it because of their legends that we get at the beginning of being connected very strongly with the whales and how they are practically human beings in terms of their intelligence and spiritual significance. And so for hundreds of them to die in a day is a tragedy. But underlines the way, that the stakes are this kind of life and death struggle, again, this deep, sharp division. And it comes down to a way of thinking that Pucka talks about to them that, the colonizers have brought a way of thinking about the world that has to do with like, here's the natural world over here. And then here are stories about the natural world that are superstition and that are supernatural, that are not real. They don't count. And that because of his tradition, he sees the world in a different way, that they once had a natural kind of knowledge of how to communicate directly with animals. They could talk to the whales directly, just like they talk to other people, but they've lost this kind of technology, if you will, over time. And it's not miraculous or spiritual. It is a way of being. It's something you can learn just as much as the biker guys are going in there and learning the Maori language. They could be learning the whale language, presumably. And so I don't think that there's a direct conflict that the story is necessarily presenting with things like, the characters riding around on motorcycles and stuff, and that somehow diminishes their connection with their true culture, quote unquote, or something absurd like that. Instead, riding around on a motorcycle is part of human knowledge, human technology, which is a natural element in the world. And equally natural is the ability of whales to communicate with each other and humans to communicate with whales and whales to communicate with humans. This is just another very natural way of being. And just like we could lose the ability to build and ride motorcycles, we've lost the ability to communicate with other animals. There's nothing supernatural, in other words, according to Pucka's kind of worldview. That is a false division that we don't need to be making that distinction. We should unlearn that distinction, if you want to say it that way. And I think this is an important idea because it's actually the thing that Pucka is doing to himself, but he is unconsciously doing it. And so he's not able to recognize it while he's teaching them about this. So he's telling them like, oh, we're making this false distinction. We shouldn't think about the world this way because it limits us. And then at the same time, he's telling Kahu that she can't be the chief. She can't learn how to be the chief because she's a girl. So he's made this distinction between people and saying, well, you're different because you're not a man. There's men over here who can be chiefs and can be spiritual leaders and can talk to the whales. And then there's women and they just do women stuff. And that's not included in all of this important things that I do. But the fact is that everyone is just people and anyone, could learn how to do this. But because of her special lineage, she kind of has it imbued inside of her already. She's sort of like a spiritual genius for this stuff. She takes to it right away. She learns the language very, very easily. She seems to be able to communicate with animals throughout the story, just on a natural level. But Pucka is in denial about all of these capabilities that she has because he is clinging to this distinction that he has forced on their society. And that distinction is limiting their ability to exist as a culture going forward. Like he's really putting their entire way of life into existential danger to preserve an element that doesn't need to be preserved. And like I said, I think that's directly mirrored by the conflict, the way he frames the conflict of this culture clash, that their way of thinking is being colonized, by the white people who have come to New Zealand. His way of thinking has been colonized by patriarchy. And so he's not able to accept what is true about his great-granddaughter. But I think women, like Pucka's wife especially, have this role in the Maori society, the way it's depicted in the book, of being a backbone to everything that happens. So they are the ones who, like, the great-grandmother is so funny. She's bosses everyone around. She always knows the right answer. Like everything that she says is true if you pay attention to the story. And I think at the end she says something like, I don't argue with people. They argue with me. I'm just right. And that's kind of true. That is kind of true in the story. And I think that the way in which, the uncle kind of has this freewheeling lifestyle and he can go out there and, meet different people and go to different islands and ride around on his motorcycle and not have too many cares or worries or, a career or anything like that, is because he takes for granted the way in which his entire society is going to be there for him in the future. And the true bedrock of the whole thing is not Pucka, who is anxiously trying to reproduce their society, it's the grandmother who has all of those traditions kind of literally in her body, in her blood, and has passed it down through the generations to Kahu. So it is the women who are kind of like the most important carriers of the true culture in the story. And you see this kind of like magical realism element mirroring this when we meet the whales and we hear the whales talking to each other. And there's this bull whale who has this magical symbol on his head that distinguishes him. And he seems to be a character who's straight out of the myth at the beginning of the book. But he has there's a cow whale with him, a mate, who talks to him in the same way that, Pucka's wife talks to him. So I think that's very, very deliberate, that the whales are just like us. They're old married couples who snipe at each other. But at the end of the day, the female whale of the group has more wisdom, correctly sees the way that Kahu needs to be protected and returned to the human world, and is able to boss around the bull in a way that shows where the true power in the relationship lies. That the bull might lead the pod of whales in a general sense, but the cow is the one leading the bull. And I think that in general, the depiction of the Maori society is similar. That the women are the fundamental element that allow for all of this freedom that the men have, but by using this freedom that they have, their culture is being eroded by the white colonizer culture. And so if they would return to the feminine, if you will, there's a way in which there could be a renaissance or a revival of the Maori culture. I think that's the promise of the ending when it talks about like Kahu is destined to do something with her tribe and she needs to go back to do that. And so that if the tribe would acknowledge her as the leader and kind of return to the feminine, there would be a firmer bedrock to build a culture that can include the Western innovations of the colonizers, but integrate them back into the kind of mythic understanding that we have at the beginning of the story, of a lack of distinctions between the so-called natural and supernatural, between the human world and the natural world, and that all of these distinctions are just ways of thinking that actually weaken our ability to be in this world and kind of cause the ruination of situations like the whales beaching themselves by the hundreds and dying. So for such a short novella, there's all kinds of rich explorations of themes, and that I'm not even talking about like the delightful characters and just like the very human, easygoing way that they have with each other, but also the way that they kind of bicker and fight, but with a deep foundation of love underneath of it that feels very cozy and heartwarming. So this is just a really lovely book to come back to again and again. And maybe one day I'll be able to say the author's name right. I feel so bad and stupid. But I'm grateful for Witi Ihimaera writing this book, and I've read it a few dozen times and try to come to a better understanding of it and have so much respect for it.